The marble steps of Hansung Global Group were cold under Solyne Baek's heels, but not as cold as the laughter behind her. She carried her whole career in a cardboard box, notebooks scrawled 5 years of work, a black folder titled My Company Plan, a framed photo of a team that had just clapped as she walked out the door. Behind her, Ha-in-yo lifted a gold trophy toward the afternoon sun, a leather binder stamped CO appointment contract, clutched to her chest like a prize she'd actually earned. Do-hyun pointed at Solyne's back and laughed. Sok-jin clapped along, delighted. To almost everyone watching, this was just a fired employee getting what she deserved. But 3 people on those steps knew better. Ha-eun, Do-hyun, and Sok-jin were the only ones at Hansung Global Group who knew the truth. Solyne Baek shared a last name, and a bed, and a decade, with Tae-geon Baek, chairman of Baek Strategic Holdings, a man whose word could move markets. And they'd bet everything on one piece of information they'd guarded like a secret weapon. He never interferes in her career. Not once. Not ever. They mistook his restraint for a leash. They were about to learn it was a loaded gun with the safety on. Solyne stopped at the bottom of the steps, didn't turn around, just lifted her phone to her ear. They stole everything I built. A pause on the line, long enough that she could hear him breathing. Are you asking me to break our rule? Another pause. This one was hers. Yes. Understood. The call ended. Behind her, the laughter kept going, oblivious, for exactly as long as laughter like that is ever allowed to last. Before we find out how Solyne built a plan worth stealing, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy stories where betrayal is met with unforgettable revenge. Now, let's go back 3 weeks earlier. The 27th floor of Hansung Global Group was dark except for one office. 11:52 p.m. The cleaning crew had already come and gone, their cart squeaking past her door twice without her looking up. Security did his rounds at midnight sharp, and every night that week he'd found the same thing. Solyne Baek, sleeves rolled, 3 monitors glowing, a coffee gone cold enough to grow a skin on top. "You're still here?" he asked. The same question he asked every night, already knowing the answer. "Almost done," she said. The same answer she gave every night, never true. On her screen, a document titled My Company Plan, 5 years old, thousands of small revisions. A 5-year growth strategy detailed enough to restructure half the company, market entries, blueprints for 2 new regional headquarters, a leadership framework she'd built line by line, alone, on nights just like this one. Nobody walking past her desk during the day would have guessed what she was building. To the general staff at Hansung, Solyne Baek was simply the strategist who never left early, never took credit she hadn't earned, and never explained herself. They didn't know she went home to a penthouse. They didn't know the last name on her ID badge matched a name that made bankers straighten their ties. Only 3 people in the entire building knew the truth. Ha-eun-yo, Do-hyun-pyo, and Sok-jin Kwak, the senior circle with just enough access to have once seen the paperwork slip. And instead of that knowledge earning Solyne any respect, it did the opposite. In private, over-expensive dinners she was never invited to, they'd worked out a theory they were certain of. Chairman Tae-geon Baek had made his wife a promise never to interfere in her career, and a promise like that, to a man like him, was as good as a signed contract. Which meant, as far as they were concerned, Solyne Baek was the only unprotected person in the building. She had no idea they were watching. She had no idea they were waiting. She just kept working, because 5 years in, she was 3 weeks from finally presenting the plan that would make her executive vice president on her own merit, without a single favor, without a single door opened for her. She had built something worth having. She just hadn't realized yet that she'd also built something worth stealing. Okay, So to understand how Solyne ended up on those marble steps, we have to go back further than 3 weeks. It was raining that night. Seoul, 7 years ago. Tae-geon Baek, the man half the financial world was already scared of, was standing in his own living room, in socks, holding both of Solyne's hands like they were something fragile. Which, honestly, for him, they were. He wasn't a man who said much. People who'd sat across from him in a boardroom would tell you that. Silence was his weapon. But that night, he said the one thing that would end up defining the next 7 years of both their lives. "I'll never stand in front of your success," he told her, "but I'll always stand behind you if you fall." Simple words, almost too simple for a man who could move a national economy with one phone call. But Solyne heard something different in it. She heard a warning label. Because she'd grown up watching it happen. Brilliant women, one after another, quietly erased. Their work absorbed into someone else's name, their credit reassigned to a husband, a boss, a mentor, anyone but them, and she'd made herself a promise long before she ever made one to Tae-geon. That was never going to be her story. So she took his words and she built a wall out of them. Not against him, against the world, against every person who'd ever look at her and see Chairman Baek's wife before they saw Solyne. At Hansung Global Group, she would just be Solyne. No last name that opened doors. No meeting where someone went easy on her because of who she went home to. Whatever she built, and trust me, she was about to build something enormous. She was going to build it in full view of people who had absolutely no idea whose hand she was holding at night. And for 5 years, it worked. She showed up before the sun. She left after security did their final walkthrough. She turned every no into a redesign, and every redesign into something better than what they'd rejected. And somewhere in there, without a single soul in that building realizing what she was actually building, Solyne started drafting the plan that would change everything. She called it, simply, My Company Plan. Now here's where I need you to really pay attention, because this next part, this is the part that changes everything downstream. Stay with me. For 2 years, Solyne built that plan in layers. A 5-year growth strategy so detailed it read less like a proposal and more like a blueprint for an entirely new company. New regional headquarters, market entries into 2 continents Hansung hadn't touched, an executive framework rebuilt from the ground up. Every late night, every skipped dinner, every version saved with a timestamp only she knew the meaning of. It all went into that file. But Solyne wasn't naive. She'd watched too many good people get robbed by people they trusted. So somewhere around month 8, she did something almost nobody else in that building would have thought to do. She built a fail-safe. Buried inside the raw code of every blueprint, she embedded a cryptographic watermark. Invisible, untraceable unless you knew exactly where to look. A digital fingerprint that would prove, beyond any argument, that this work was hers. She told herself it was just insurance. A habit from a woman who'd learned the hard way that talent alone doesn't protect you. She had no idea how soon she'd need it. Because while Solyne was pulling all-nighters building her future, 3 people on the executive floor were quietly building a plan of their own. Ha-eun-yo, Do-hyun-pyo, Seok-jin-kwak. The only 3 people at Hansung who knew what everyone else didn't, that the quiet, obsessive strategist on the 27th floor was married to Chairman Tae-geon Baek. And instead of that knowledge earning Solyne an ounce of respect, it did the exact opposite. Ha-eun-yo hadn't clawed her way up through merit. She'd clawed her way up through instinct, a razor-sharp read on which rooms mattered and which people to charm inside them. She was polished, magnetic, the kind of executive who could walk into a client dinner and have the whole table laughing within 10 minutes. What she didn't have, what she'd never had, was the one thing Solyne had built her entire career on: substance. Do-hyun Pyo was the numbers man. Careful, cautious. The type who'd never break a rule on his own, but who'd happily stand behind someone else breaking it, as long as his name stayed clean on paper. And Seokjin Kwak was ambition without a compass. He didn't care whose plan it was. He just wanted to be standing next to whoever won. Three very different people, one shared blind spot. All three of them looked at Solyne, quiet, married into more money than any of them would see in 3 lifetimes, and still choosing to grind the way she ground. And they didn't see discipline. They saw a woman playing some strange, self-imposed game. And people playing games, in their minds, could be beaten. Over private dinners Solyne was never invited to, in a private group chat none of them ever thought would surface. They built a theory, and they built it with total confidence. Chairman Baek had made his wife a promise. Never interfere in her career. And a promise like that, from a man like him, that was as good as a locked door. Which meant, as far as they were concerned, Solyne Baek was the only unprotected person in that entire building. She had a target on her back and didn't even know it. So one night, while she was in a client meeting she'd fought for months to get, Ha-eun made a call. Quiet. She had IT cloned Solyne's drive. Every file, every folder, every version of my company plan, copied byte for byte onto a private server with Ha-eun's name attached to it instead. They didn't know about the watermark. How could they? It was buried so deep in the code that unless you were specifically looking for it, unless you were Solyne, you'd never even know it was there. They thought they'd just stolen a plan. They had no idea they'd stolen a trap. 3 weeks later. The boardroom on the top floor of Hansung Global Group. Glass walls. City skyline behind 12 executives who'd spent a decade clawing their way to those seats. Ha-eun walked in holding a printed copy of My Company Plan like it was something she'd bled for. She presented it flawlessly. Every projection, every market entry, every restructuring detail. Solyne's work, recited in Ha-eun's voice, met with nods from a room that had no idea they were applauding theft. And when one board member, an older man, sharp, one of the few who actually asked good questions, turned to Ha-eun and said, "This is remarkable. Who else worked on this with you?" Ha-eun didn't even flinch. "Just me," she said. "I've been developing this independently for 2 years." Ha-eun said it without blinking. She'd rehearsed that line in the mirror the night before, over and over, until it stopped sounding like a lie even to her. The board ate it up, nodding, leaning forward. But Ha-eun wasn't done. Because stealing the plan wasn't enough. Not if Solyne was still in the building to ask questions about it. So a week before that presentation, Ha-eun had already set the second half of her plan in motion. Quietly, ruthlessly. She framed Solyne for a data leak. Fabricated logs, doctored timestamps, a trail of evidence that made it look like Solyne. Brilliant, obsessive, up at 2 a.m., Solyne had been the one leaking confidential company data to an outside party. It was airtight, it was believable, and it was a complete and total lie. By the time the board finished applauding Ha-eun's independent masterpiece, they'd already signed off on something else entirely. Solyne's termination, effective immediately, and Ha-eun's appointment as the new CEO of Hansung Global Group. Sealed inside a black leather binder stamped in gold foil. CEO appointment contract. They thought they'd won. They genuinely believed, down to their bones, that there was nothing Solyne could do. That her husband's hands were tied by his own promise. They forgot one very, very important thing. You don't survive 5 years quietly outworking every person in that building without becoming the smartest one in the room. Solyne packed her desk in under 10 minutes. Notebooks, a framed photo of a team she'd trusted, blueprints stamped confidential, every piece of 5 years, folded into a single cardboard box that suddenly felt like it weighed more than she did. Nobody on that floor said a word to her. Nobody met her eyes. Not because they hated her. Most of them had no idea what had actually happened. But because in offices like that one, silence is the safest thing a person can offer someone who's losing. She understood it. That didn't make it hurt less. Security walked her out, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Past a floor full of people who had no idea what they were watching. To them, this was just another termination. Another employee who didn't work out. But when the glass doors opened onto the front steps, Ha-eun was already waiting. Trophy raised. Contract clutched to her chest like a war medal. Do-hyun pointing, laughing, Seok-jin clapping like he was watching a show he'd paid good money for, and Solyne, sharp-eyed, spine straight, absolutely refusing to give them the reaction they wanted, walked past all of it without a single word, until she reached the bottom step, until she pulled out her phone, until she called the one number she had promised herself. 5 years ago, she would never call for something like this. He picked up on the second ring. "They stole everything I built," she said. No shake in her voice, just fact. Silence on the other end, long enough that she could hear him breathing. Long enough that somewhere in that silence, a version of Tae-geon Baek that the public had never met, quiet, still, terrifyingly patient, was already waking up. "Are you asking me to break our rule?" "Yes." One word from him back. Understood. The call ended. And on those steps, nothing looked different yet. The laughter kept going. The trophy stayed raised. Ha-in, Do-hyun, Seok-jin. None of them felt anything shift. But something had. Something enormous. Because 41 floors above the trading room where nobody had touched Hansung Global Group's stock in years without warning, a single message went out from Baek Strategic Holdings. 4 words, sent to a legal and financial team who'd been on standby, quietly, for exactly this kind of call. Activate the Hansung Protocol. Tae-geon Baek had spent over a decade building Baek Strategic Holdings into something the public understood in only the broadest strokes. A legendary investment firm, a name attached to acquisitions so massive they made front-page news for a single day and then vanished from public memory. What the public didn't know, what almost nobody outside a small, tightly controlled circle knew, was how deep that reach actually went. Within hours, teams that had been quietly tracking Hansung Global Group's financials for years, not because anyone suspected this exact scenario, but because Tae-geon never left anything to chance where his wife's company was concerned, moved into position. Hansung had debt. Every company that size does. Debt that, under normal circumstances, would sit quietly on a balance sheet for years, refinanced and forgotten. But debt like that has a weakness if you know exactly where to press. And Tae-geon's people had spent years quietly mapping every inch of it. Baek Strategic Holdings began acquiring it, piece by piece, contract by contract, moving through back channels so clean that even Hansung's own financial officers wouldn't notice the pattern until it was already too late to stop. At the same time, they began shorting Hansung's stock. Quietly, strategically, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to apply pressure exactly where a company that had just installed an unqualified new CEO could least afford it. Ha-eun-yo walked into her first official week as CEO, believing she'd already won. She redecorated the top floor office within 48 hours. New chair, new nameplate, a framed copy of that CEO appointment contract, hung where every visitor would see it first. She had no idea the ground underneath Hansung Global Group had already started to shift. By day 3, a junior analyst in Hansung's finance department noticed something strange. A series of debt instruments that had quietly changed hands. routed through 3 shell entities before landing somewhere nobody could quite trace. He flagged it. His manager told him not to worry about it. Nobody worried about it. Nobody thought to. By day 5, Hansung's stock had dipped 2 points on unusually high short volume, the kind of thing that, on any other week, would have triggered a dozen phone calls from anxious investors. Instead, it got explained away as market noise, a slow news cycle, nothing to see. There was plenty to see. They just didn't know where to look. No idea that somewhere in a private office with a view of the whole city, a man the public called untouchable, a man who had never once, in 7 years of marriage, lifted a finger to interfere in his wife's career, was finally, quietly, methodically, unleashing everything he'd built to make sure nobody would ever be foolish enough to try this again. And Solyne? Solyne wasn't sitting at home waiting for her husband to fix this for her. Don't make that mistake. This isn't a story about a woman who needed saving. Because somewhere in a private conversation with Tae-geon that night, one neither of them raised their voice in, one that was less about revenge and more about strategy, Solyne told him something that changed the entire shape of what was coming. "Don't clear the board for me," she said. "Clear it so I can finish what I started. Because remember that watermark? The one buried so deep in the code of my company plan that Ha-eun never even knew to look for it?" Solyne hadn't forgotten about it. Not for 1 second. She was just waiting for the exact right moment to use it. Because what's coming isn't just a boardroom takeover anymore. What's coming is bigger than Hansung Global Group, bigger than a stolen contract, bigger than 3 executives who thought they'd found a loophole. There's a reason nobody's ever tested Tae-geon Baek's limits before. And by the time Ha-eun, Do-hyun, and Suk-jin figure out why, they won't just be fighting to keep their titles. They'll be fighting to keep everything. It happened on a Thursday morning. 9 days into Ha-eun-yeo's reign as CEO of Hansung Global Group, and she was finally ready to do the one thing she'd been dying to do since the moment that black leather binder landed in her hands. Launch it. The plan. Solyne's plan. Her plan now. At least, that's what she believed. She'd scheduled it like a coronation. A live systems rollout, broadcast internally to every department, timed to coincide with a press release already sitting in a queue, ready to announce Hansung's bold new 5-year expansion to every financial outlet that mattered. Champagne was literally chilling in a back office. That's how confident she was. At 9:41 a.m., Ha-eun stood in front of a room of nervous IT staff and gave the order. Initiate deployment. Someone hit enter. And for about 4 seconds, nothing happened. 4 seconds of silence that Ha-eun would later describe, under oath, to people who were absolutely not on her side, as the longest 4 seconds of her life. Then the screens went red. Not one screen. Every screen. Every terminal connected to that rollout, across every department, through the exact same error at the exact same moment. A cascading system halt that locked every file, froze every dashboard, and shut the entire deployment down cold. IT staff started typing frantically, restarting terminals, running diagnostics that came back clean every single time, which somehow made it worse. Because if the system was clean, why wasn't anything working? Here's what nobody in that room understood yet. What Ha-eun, standing there with her face slowly draining of color, had absolutely no way of knowing. She never imagined she'd need it. The moment that system detected an unauthorized deployment, it didn't just glitch. It shut the whole thing down. Mid-launch, mid-press release, mid-champagne. In front of the one audience Ha-eun could least afford to have watching. Because by 10:15 that same morning, word had already reached the trading floor. Nobody outside Hansung knew the technical details. Nobody needed to. All they saw was a company that had just announced a massive expansion, quietly, catastrophically failed to launch it, live, on the exact morning it was supposed to happen. By noon, Hansung's stock had dropped 11%. By close of trading, it had dropped closer to 22%. In one day, hundreds of millions in market value gone before the closing bell even rang, and every financial reporter in the country asking the exact same question. What just happened inside Hansung Global Group? Ha-eun didn't have an answer, because the honest answer wasn't something she could say out loud to anyone. Now, before we go any further with what was happening to Ha-eun, I need to take you somewhere else. Because while all of this was unfolding on the trading floor, Solyne wasn't sitting at home waiting for updates. She was working. Solyne had turned a spare room in the penthouse into something that looked less like an office and more like an investigation. Timelines taped to the wall, printed screenshots, a laptop open to an inbox she'd almost forgotten she still had access to, a personal backup she'd quietly set up years earlier, syncing copies of her own work emails to an account nobody at Hansung knew existed. She wasn't trying to get her job back. She was building a case. The room itself told the story of how seriously she was taking it. A whiteboard covered in dates, arrows, and question marks that slowly, night after night, started turning into answers. The first thing she found, going through those backed-up emails, was a message she'd sent herself 11 months earlier, a routine confirmation from IT, time-stamped, showing exactly when the master drive containing My Company Plan had last been accessed by her own credentials. She cross-referenced it against a second date. The date Ha-eun's presentation claimed the work had begun. They didn't match, not even close. She kept going. Old drafts she'd saved to a personal drive out of habit, each one carrying metadata Hansung's own systems had never touched. Creation dates, revision histories, tiny fingerprints of a process that had clearly started long before Ha-eun ever claimed it had. None of it was dramatic on its own, but stacked together, night after night, it started to look less like a hunch and more like a case file. Then came the phone call that mattered more than any of the ones from lawyers or bankers. A junior analyst named Ji-woo, someone Solyne had mentored quietly for 2 years, someone who'd never once been on Ha-eun's radar, reached out on an encrypted messaging app, voice low, clearly checking to make sure nobody could overhear him. "I don't know if this means anything," he said, "but I remember an IT ticket. From a few weeks before you left, someone requested a full drive clone, executive override. I only remember because it was flagged as unusual, and then it just disappeared from the system a day later." Solyne didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked him the only question that mattered. "Do you remember whose name was on the request?" He did. That single conversation gave Solyne something no lawyer, no press conference, no financial maneuver ever could have. A living witness, and a paper trail with an actual date on it. She spent the rest of that night pulling every server log Ji-woo could quietly point her toward, cross-checking backup timestamps, rebuilding a timeline of exactly when her files had been copied, by whom, and how it had been buried afterward. 2 more analysts reached out over the following week, once word quietly spread that someone was finally asking the right questions. But each one added a small piece. A meeting they remembered. A comment Do-hyun had made in passing that suddenly meant something different in hindsight. A file transfer log one of them had noticed and never thought twice about. The ground underneath Hansung kept shifting. Do-hyun Pyo sat in his lawyer's office 2 days after the crash, trying to quietly move money before anyone came looking for it. He logged into an offshore account he hadn't touched in months. Withdrawal suspended, compliance flag, no further explanation offered. He tried a second account, same result. A third, set up years earlier under a shell company nobody was supposed to know existed, flagged as well, under review for irregularities in its ownership structure. His lawyer stopped taking notes and just watched him, quietly, Ha-eun hit the same wall that same afternoon, in a different country, through a different bank. Her wire transfer request came back flagged for enhanced due diligence. Her shell company's registered agent apologized and mentioned, almost too casually, that regulators had opened an inquiry into the entity's ownership. Routine, he called it. Nothing about his tone sounded routine at all. Seok-jin, watching both of them scramble from the sidelines, tried something different. A smaller transfer, under a threshold he was sure wouldn't trigger anything. It cleared, for about 11 hours. Then it bounced back to his account with a note that simply read, "Transaction reversed, pending compliance review." Even the money that got through didn't stay through. When Tae-geon's legal team compiled the evidence of the theft, the falsified breach, and the suspicious timing of three executives' personal offshore transfers, and handed it directly to financial crimes regulators, those regulators didn't sit on it. They moved, fast. No money vanished into anyone's pocket. Nothing got frozen by magic. It just became impossible to touch, because once the right people start asking the right questions, backed by real documentation, the system does the rest on its own. There was no escape route left for any of them. Not one. 6 days after the crash, Hansung's board was forced into an emergency session, the kind companies only hold when there's genuinely nothing left to debate. Baek Strategic Holdings, by that point, controlled the overwhelming majority of Hansung's outstanding debt, and debt at that scale stops being just debt. It becomes leverage, a seat nobody can vote you out of. Tae-geon's legal team walked in with a restructuring proposal that gave the board exactly two choices: approve the transition to Baek Strategic Holdings as the controlling parent entity, or watch the company collapse under obligations it no longer had any way of covering. It should have ended there. It almost did, until one board member, an older man who'd sat through 3 decades of Hansung history, leaned forward and said the thing nobody else in that room had the nerve to say out loud. Chairman Baek. Even if everything in this room is true, the falsified breach, the theft, all of it, you still haven't proven that plan belongs to Mrs. Baek. You've proven a crime happened. You haven't proven who the victim actually is. A few heads around the table nodded, slowly, like they'd been thinking it too and were relieved someone else had said it first. This was the moment the whole meeting could have gone sideways. Baek Strategic Holdings had the leverage to force a vote regardless, but leverage isn't the same as legitimacy, and everyone in that room knew the difference mattered. The room went still. Tae-geon didn't answer right away, because this wasn't his moment to answer. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Solyne had been sitting quietly the entire meeting, saying nothing, waiting for exactly this. She stood, walked to the front, opened a folder she'd built herself, over 3 sleepless nights, out of backed-up emails, a junior analyst's quiet testimony, and a timeline that lined up with mathematical precision. She didn't unveil everything. Not yet. She laid out just enough. The drive access records, the IT ticket Jiwoo remembered, the timestamps that put her own work months ahead of anything Ha-eun had ever claimed, enough to make the older board member sit back in his chair, slowly, and nod once. "That's a start," he said. "But I imagine there's more." "There's more," Solyne said. "I'm saving it." By the end of that meeting, Baek Strategic Holdings officially became the majority stakeholder of Hansung Global Group. But it wasn't a formality this time. It was earned, in that room, by a woman who'd shown up with proof instead of just a last name. Which brings us to the press conference. A packed auditorium. Cameras from every major outlet. Hansung's remaining board seated up front. Ha-eun near the back, still technically CEO for another few hours, her expression fighting to hold together in public. Do-hyun and Seok-jin weren't even there. Both of them had their own lawyers to worry about by then. Tae-geon walked in first. No entourage, no dramatic pause, just a man in a dark suit, walking to the podium with a calm that felt louder than shouting. 6 weeks ago, he said, this company terminated an employee based on falsified evidence in order to steal 5 years of her work. That employee is my wife. You could have heard a pin drop. He laid out the fabricated breach, the cloned files, the offshore transfers tied to compensation packages built on a plan that was never theirs. Then he dismissed the corrupted portion of the board on the spot and stripped Ha-eun of her title, in front of the exact cameras that had covered her appointment weeks earlier. Ha-eun stood, tried to speak. Her voice cracked halfway through the same tired line about independent work. Then something shifted in her face, a flicker of the old confidence. She looked at Solyne, standing quietly near the front, and something about the silence between them convinced her she still had one card left. Fine, she said, straightening her jacket, forcing something like a smile. You think you can prove it's yours? Go ahead. Solyne didn't answer her. She just walked to the podium. Don't look away for this part. This is what the whole story has been building toward. She opened her laptop, connected it to the display, and this time, she didn't hold anything back. Every file in that plan, she said, contains a hidden authentication layer, a cryptographic watermark embedded at the code level, time-stamped the moment each section was created. I built it years ago, not because I expected this, because I'd learned the hard way not to trust rooms full of people who smile at you. Ha-eun found her nerve for one more round. Those files could have been edited afterward, she said, louder now, playing to the cameras as much as the room. Doctored. There's no way to actually prove any of that. Solyne smiled. Good point. She opened the version history first. Thousands of incremental saves stretching back 2 full years, each one time-stamped, each one showing the plan evolving in small, exhausting increments no one fabricates after the fact. That's just software, Ha-eun snapped. Anyone can manipulate a timestamp. They can, Solyne agreed, which is why I never relied on just one. She pulled up the cloud backups next, external to Hansung's own servers entirely, syncing automatically every night since before Ha-eun had ever laid eyes on the file. Hosted on infrastructure Hansung's IT department had no access to and no way to touch. Then the email timestamps, pulled from her own backed-up inbox, months ahead of anything Ha-eun claimed. Then the server logs Jiwoo had quietly helped her track down, showing the exact override request, the exact name attached to the drive clone, on the exact night it happened, a name that was not Solyne's. Ha-eun opened her mouth again. Nothing came out this time. There was nowhere left to redirect the argument. Every excuse she'd been holding on to, edited files, manipulated timestamps, an independent 2 years of work, had just been answered, one after another, by a woman who'd apparently anticipated every single objection years before Ha-eun ever thought to raise it. The room didn't just go quiet, it went still. Because everyone watching, the board, the press, cameras beaming this live across 3 continents, understood exactly what they were looking at. The color left her face completely. She didn't say another word. What was there left to say? The legitimate board members didn't need long to deliberate. Within the hour, in a vote so unanimous it barely needed counting, Solyne Baek was appointed CEO of Hansung Global Group, not handed the position, not gifted through her husband's leverage. Earned, twice over, once in a boardroom and once in front of the entire country. The night before her first official day as CEO, Solyne sat on the floor of the penthouse, surrounded by the same notebooks that once filled that cardboard box, reading 5 years of her own handwriting in silence. Tae-geon found her there past midnight and sat down beside her without a word. I keep thinking about how close it came to disappearing, she finally said. Not the company. This. She held up a notebook. If they'd gotten away with it, nobody would have ever known this part was mine. They didn't get away with it, he said quietly. I know, but it could have gone the other way. If I hadn't built the watermark, if I hadn't kept every backup, if Jiwoo hadn't remembered that ticket. You did, though. He set the notebook down gently. You spent 5 years protecting something you built with your own mind, long before anyone tried to take it. I didn't win that fight for you, Solyne. You'd already won it. I just made sure nobody got to keep pretending otherwise. She didn't say anything else. Solyne's first act as CEO wasn't revenge. She promoted the people who'd actually earned it, Ji-woo among them, along with every analyst and junior staffer who'd stayed late without being asked, or treated her with basic decency during the week she needed it most. She rebuilt the company one honest promotion at a time, and within months, Hansung Global Group looked less like the place it had been for years and more like somewhere people were actually proud to work. Tae-geon stepped back completely. No board seat, no interviews about a takeover that had briefly made him one of the most talked about businessmen in the country. Because none of that had ever been the point for him. The point had only ever been standing behind the person he loved, exactly the way he'd promised. The last time cameras caught the two of them together, outside the very building where Solyne had once carried a cardboard box down the marble steps. She wasn't carrying anything at all. She walked out through those same glass doors as CEO, fingers laced with his. Not for the cameras, just because that's what they did. A reporter shouted a question as they passed, something about how it felt coming back to the place she'd been humiliated, this time as the one in charge. Solyne stopped for a second, glanced up at the entrance she knew every inch of. It feels like the truth finally caught up, she said, and kept walking. Standing on those steps now, holding the hand of a man who'd never once tried to take credit for what she'd built, she finally understood she'd had it backwards the whole time. Being loved by someone powerful never made her small. It just meant that when the world tried to take everything she'd built, she wasn't the only one standing there to defend it. As for Ha-eun, Do-hyun, and Suk-jin, regulators didn't lose interest once the cameras moved on. The inquiries that started with frozen withdrawals turned into formal charges within the year, and none of the three ever set foot in an executive boardroom again. Ji-woo, on the other hand, was sitting 2 floors below Solyne's new office within 6 months, running the analytics team he'd once only dreamed of leading. And if this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, do me a favor before you go. Subscribe. Quinn's Afro-Korea Diaries has stories exactly like this one waiting for you, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me which moment got you the most. The trap, the reveal, or that final walk out the door. I read every single one. Thank you for staying until the very end of this one. It means more than you know.